Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be going over a famous game between Lasker and Capablanca. And these were two great world chess champions back in the early 1900s, late 1800s. Lasker was the world champion for actually 27 years, which is quite a long time. And Capablanca, as many regard as one of the best players of all time, especially in the endgame. His endgame play over the board was just magnificent, which as we get deeper into this game that we're going to analyze today, it's kind of interesting how this game played out as far as the end game. So we'll go ahead and get into it. Lasker is playing the white pieces, and Capablanca is going to be playing the black pieces. And starts out with pawn e4, pawn e5, knight f3, knight c6, and then bishop to b5, getting into the Ruy Lopez. And from here, Capablanca decides to come to a6, very common move. And Lasker decides to exchange on c6. Now, it is very common to exchange, or a lot of times you will see the bishop come back to a4 and then retreat back to b3 here, attacking the f7 square. But in this case, Lasker did decide to go ahead and play the exchange variation, and he plays bishop takes on c6, and black recaptures with his pawn, opening up this d file for his queen here. Now from here, white decided to bring his pawn to d4. Keep in mind that it is very common now for white to castle on the king side, but Lasker played d4, signifying that he's ready to get into the endgame very quickly. He doesn't want there to be a long middle game, which is surprising considering his opponent is such a strong endgame player. But Lasker must have felt pretty confident going into this and played d4. After black captured here on d4, then white decided to come up and recapture with his queen on d4, again signifying that he wants to get these queens off the board, and he wants to advance very quickly into the endgame. There's not going to be a very long middle game going here after both sides castle. Both sides are really going to try to get active, get their kings activated, and then start going for an endgame. From here, Capablanca obliged and took with his queen on d4, getting ready to go into the endgame, and white recaptured with his knight on d4. Now black had two options here. He probably could have had more than that, but the most typical move from here from black would be to bring his bishop to d7. As far as just opening principles and theory behind the opening, since this knight from b8 is already gone, and this queen is no longer taking this d8 square, getting your light squared bishop from black into the game, and at the same time allowing your king to castle on the queen side with this rook nicely placed on the open d file, you can obviously castle your king much faster than you can on the king side. So keep this in mind. In the game, Capablanca went ahead and played bishop to d6, but again Capablanca will have to play another move, get his knight here from g8 also into the game before he can castle, but it looks like he wants to castle on the king side. But if you come to this position in your own game, you can see that bishop to d7 is not only an okay move, but it may be preferred because of opening principles that we just talked about. So in this game, we play continued with bishop to d6, and now knight continues to develop to c3 from white, and black now brings his knight to e7, both sides getting ready to castle. White castles and black castles. Now so far in the game, nothing crazy has happened. Both sides have just been developing all their pieces. From here, white can bring his dark square bishop into the game if he wants to, connecting the rooks. You always want to connect your rooks as far as opening principles. Same with black here. He can develop his light squared bishop, get that into the game, and at the same time he will connect his rooks along this 8th rank as well. From here, Lasker decided to go on to the attack, and he played pawn to f4. His king is a little bit in danger, but since the queens are off the board, his king is a little less in danger than it would be before. If, let's say, the queens were not traded off, this would be a little less safe of a king than it is now. But Lasker decided to go ahead and continue up the board with pawn to f4, and black played rook to e8, getting his rook on this semi-open file. But another move that black could have played is bringing his bishop to c5, pinning this knight down to the king. It doesn't matter who you are, you really don't want to be playing with your pieces pinned down, especially to your king, just because it's another thing that you have to worry about. And you really don't want to have a lot of different weaknesses in a chess game, because the more weaknesses you have, the better chance your opponent has to exploit those weaknesses. But Capablanca decided not to do this and decided instead to bring his rook to e8, which seems logical. You know, you want to get your rooks involved, and he has this semi-open file along the e file here so far. White now is going to bring his knight to b3. One, he does not want to get his knight pinned down to the king, so that's something to think about. After Lasker saw this, he obviously wanted to bring his pawn to f4, but at the same time, he doesn't want to have to worry about this knight being pinned down the entire game. So from here, Black played pawn to f6, and it's a very interesting move if you think about what all Black wants to do in this game. He really does not want White to control the center of the board. White played this pawn to f4 because he really wants to control the center right away. And so Black is trying to, in essence, control this e5 square right away. It's a very important square, and since White has already played pawn to f4, Black, Capablanca, is really trying to put a lot of pressure on this e5 square, trying not to give it up right away. Now the next move from White was a very important move as far as what his goal was in the game. So if you just pause it and think about what White should do in this situation. And if you think about all the different options that White has, one of his best ones is to bring his pawn to f5, which is what he did in the game. A lot of beginner players will say, you know what, before I do anything in a chess game, I need to develop all my pieces, connect my rooks, and then continue with the game. But if you look at this, Lasker can already tell right away, you know what, if I bring my pawn to f5, since his pawn already here on f6, then I'm pretty much, in essence, blocking off this light square bishop from Black. He's not going to bring it to, to d7. That's not doing anything. He can't bring it to e6. He's going to have to bring it to b7 if he wants to get involved. But to do that, he's going to have to move this pawn from b7 and this pawn from c6. So this pawn here on f5, even before he develops his dark square bishop, is really limiting the squares that Black can play his light square bishop. So anytime, even before you develop all your pieces and connect your rooks and get your king involved in the end game, you really want to look at what your opponent's doing and see if you can block off some of his potential moves down the road. If you can limit some of the pieces that he can get involved, that's usually a good thing. From here, Capablanca decided to bring his pawn to b6. Again, now that his light square bishop's blocked off on this diagonal, he really needs to find a way to get it involved somewhere else. So he's getting ready to bring his bishop to b7. It's going to take a few moves, but he does obviously want to get this involved. Now from here, White decided to bring his bishop to f4 right away. His dark square bishop, a lot of times from White, his dark square bishop isn't doing too much, so he decides to go ahead and bring it to f4. And at the same time, he's really threatening putting this pawn here on d6. Now, as someone may have told me a long time ago, at the beginning of the game, you always want to control the center of the board with your pawns. At the end of the game, you want to control the center of the board with your pieces and not your pawns. You'd rather have your pieces in the middle and your pawns on the outside. If your pawns are in the middle, it's very easy for your opponent with any of his pieces to control those pawns. But if you have pawns on both sides of the board, it's very hard for him to attack or control both sides or both pawn structures that you have. So White is playing, obviously he's developing his bishop to f4, but at the same time he's challenging. He's saying, I'm going to undouble your pawns here, but at the same time I'm going to give you a pawn here on d6. If he recaptures, it's going to be very hard for you to hold on to later in the game. So that's kind of why this was played out. From here, Black decided to play his bishop to b7. A lot of scholars and analysts, decided that Capablanca just didn't think that Lasker would undouble up these pawns here, but that's exactly what Lasker did. He went ahead and captured on d6, and Black recaptured with his pawn on d6. So right away you can see here that this pawn here on d6 is going to be a huge thorn for Black as he tries to control, this pawn here in the middle of the board, and pretty much all the pieces that White has are going to be just aiming for this d6 pawn for a while. So if we look at it now, it's White's play again, and White just played an amazing game. So I really want you to pause and think about what White's strategy should be now. And hopefully you see that this square here on e6 is a great outpost, especially for a knight. So in white's mind, his plan right away, he's already developed his pieces, he already has his rooks connected, he can get those involved into the game whenever he wants to, but he really wants to get a knight here on e6. It's going to be a very powerful piece, and right away there's nothing that black can do, to take that away. If he wants to bring his bishop back to c8, he can, but again, black's wasting moves here if he brings his bishop to b7 and then back to c8 to challenge this knight here on e6. So that's exactly what Lasker does. He brings his knight back to d4 so that he can place his knight nicely on this e6 square. From here, black decided to bring his rook to d8, and this has been a very criticized move by many analysts. They really think that black should have played bishop to c8, pretty much putting your ego aside and saying, you know what, I made a mistake, I shouldn't have played my bishop to b7 in the first place, I should have just kept it here on c8, because this rook here on d8 is not stopping this knight, and at the same time this knight's not going to be kicked off for a while, and it's going to be a very vital square for white to control here with his knight. So black decided to play rook to d8, trying to put a little bit more pressure on this pawn to d6 that we talked about was already a weakness for black, and white continues with his plan, bringing his knight to e6. So right away, white has a very strong attack. He has, this knight here on e6 attacking this rook. Obviously the rook's going to come to d7. There's no reason for him to retreat back. Why would he have come to d8 in the first place? So he comes to d7, and now white starts to get his rooks involved. He brings his rook to d1, and now black here brings his knight to c8. He obviously wants to try to add a little bit more pressure to this d6 square. Again, it is a huge weakness for black. From here, white's going to bring his rook to f2, probably thinking that he wants to, next bring it to d2 whenever he wants to, and start to again add more and more pressure to this d6 square. From here, black played pawn to b5. Now this is probably a questionable move because black really wants to get his light squared bishop into the game, and it probably would have made a little bit more sense if he tried to move like a6, and then he could have brought his pawn to a5, and then he could have brought his bishop to a6, could have brought it down to c4, and then he could have challenged this knight here on e6 that we talked about is very strong. Capablanca didn't see it that way. Instead, he decided to bring his pawn to b5. And this is a very important move from white. White decided to bring his rook to d2 first, and then after the rook comes to e7, white decided to bring his pawn to b4. Now if you look at this, right away, white, even though this pawn is unprotected, he's basically trying to lock in this pawn structure that black has along these, white squares here. Now, when you approach the endgame, your bishop, you really don't want to have it on the same colored square. So right away, Capablanca has this light square bishop, and his pawns here are blocking it in. You want to be attacking your opponent's pawns and not be blocked in by your own. So right now, this move b4, it looks kind of harmless, but at the same way, it locks in this pawn structure, which really limits what black can do here with his light square bishop. So from here, black starts to get his king into the game. Now that we've kind of approached the endgame, or the starting stages of the endgame, you always want to start to centralize your king, because he's a very, very strong attacker in the endgame. White's going to continue to bring his pawn to a3, putting another supporter on this b4 pawn. Now, black plays bishop to a8 here, and this has also been criticized as a poor move from Capablanca. And when Capablanca went back and looked at this game, he actually said that if he would have played rook to e6, and after the pawn takes and he were to retake with his rook, that he could actually have drawn this game. But at the time, he said that he was all over the board and trying to find different ways to counter, and he just decided to play bishop to a8 because he did not want to go ahead and play rook takes on e6. But looking back, he said that was probably the smart move. This really doesn't do much for black's development. He's kind of just waiting for white to attack. So from here, white decides to start to get his king involved into the game, and now black plays rook to a7, and this is probably because he wants to have some counterplay on the queen side. He's probably going to look to play his pawn to a5, try to open up this a file so he can get his rook into the game by this. Once he opens up this A file, get his rook into the game if he wants to. He can play this pawn down to c5, get his light squared bishop into the game. Maybe if he wants to swing his other rook into the action once his bishop's no longer here on a8. So Capablanca really is trying to have some counterplay into the game by playing rook to a7. White continues with pawn to g4. Again, now that all of his pieces are really developed and they're exactly where they need to be, he's really going to start to try to attack on the king side. He sees that black's trying to attack on the queen side here. So since all his pieces are centralized and they can get to anywhere on the board, he's going to go ahead and start to attack on the king side. And so black's going to try to limit some of the pressure that white's putting on here by playing pawn to h6. And now white's going to play rook to d3, really allowing this rook to get into the game on the king side if he needs to. It's a little bit limited if he is on the d2 square, but bringing it to the d3 square, it allows him if he needs to swing over to h3, or if he starts to push up this h-pawn, he can always swing his rook over there, and he's not blocked off by this king here on f2. From here, black's going to continue with his plan that we talked about, bringing his pawn to a5, and white's going to disregard this. There's no reason to take on here. It's basically just giving up a move, and then you have this pawn on a3 hanging here. So he's going to continue to attack on the king side. After black captures, white recaptures on b4, and then a very interesting move that again has been criticized for a long time against Capablanca. He moves his rook back to e7, and this is questionable because he opened this a file up probably so he can have some counterplay on this queen side, but he brought his rook here from e7 over to a7 and now has brought it back to e7. So it looks like Capablanca is coming up with a plan, trying to execute that, and then at the last minute is just retreating and isn't quite sure what he wants to do here. Now from here, Lasker just decided to continue with his plan. He played king to f3, trying to get his king involved into the game. Again, more centralized, that you can get your king in the endgame is always good. And black decided to bring his rook to g8, knowing that the king side is going to be attacked, so he wants to get his pieces involved if he needs them there. And white plays king to f4, again continuing what we talked about, getting your king involved. His other pieces are again nicely placed, just waiting for the opportunity to arise where they may be needed. And black's going to play pawn to g6, just trying to counterplay a little bit, opening up this g file if he needs to. Again, really trying to find some counterplay, because as you can see right now, black's been pretty passive as far as his defenses. He's just kind of been roaming around, moving his pieces back and forth, and so he's trying to open up the game here any way he can. From here, white decided to bring his rook to g3, again solidifying, putting a little bit more pressure on the king side. You always want to have rooks behind your pieces as they push up the board, especially your pawns. And from here, black decided to try to close this off a little bit if he could, and bring his pawn to g5. White would have really liked to play his pawn to g5 if he could have, but black kind of beat him to the punch and played pawn to g5 here. So the king's going to retreat back a little bit, bringing his king back to f3. And then the knight's going to try to get involved into the action. And he kind of leaves his pawn hanging here if white wanted to take on d6. But you always got to keep in mind, a lot of times if you're playing a weak player, they may actually leave this pawn for you to take. If you're playing a player like Capablanca, who's one of the strongest players of all time, he's not going to bring his knight here to b6 just so Lasker can come in and take extra material and kind of dominate the middle of the board. So if we look at this here, and if white were to take on d6, then Capablanca could bring his knight down to c4, attacking this rook here on d6. After the rook moves, then the knight can come to e5, and this is again a great square, much like this e6 square is a great square for the knight. This e5 square is a great square for black here. And yes, black did give up a pawn, but at the same time, black now has a lot of counterplay. He has a very centralized knight that's attacking. He can bring his rooks into the action on the d file, and at the same time, this knight here on e5 is going to be a thorn in white's side the entire game. So thankfully for Lasker, he decided to avoid this and realized that he didn't need to take this pawn on d6. It's going to be a huge weakness, as we talked about all game. It's going to be hard for black to defend this pawn, so he decides to completely disregard this and continue with his plan. And his plan is right now to attack on the king side. So he's going to take with his pawn on g5, and after black recaptures on g5, then he's going to bring his rook to h3, trying to attack this open file. You always want your rooks on open files, so white right away is going to bring his rook to h3 along this open file. Black from here responded with his rook to d7. Again, he doesn't want to leave this pawn hanging too much. Obviously, he brought his knight to b6 here. He did leave it hanging. He doesn't want to leave it hanging too long here. So he does bring his rook back to d7. White decided to bring his king to g3. As you can tell, this light square bishop, it's not into the game yet, but down the road it could be. So white really wants to get his king off this long white diagonal, just in case, this pawn were to move up, at any time. This pawn, if he comes down to c5, would open up the door for a discovered attack on the king here. So he really wants to avoid that. From here, black decided to bring his king to e8, and now a masterful move from white here. He brings his rook to h1, and it's really starting to put a lot of pressure on black, and there's not a whole lot that black can do here as far as counterplay. Black decides to bring his bishop to b7. As you can see here, there's just not a lot of good moves that black has here. And then white plays pretty much the crucial move in the entire game, and that's pawn to e5. And if you want to take a minute just to look at the situation and think about what pawn to e5 does, it's a magnificent move, and it does so much. And one of the really important things that it does is it allows this knight here to come to e4. And once this knight comes to e4, it's just going to be a huge thorn in black's side, and there's not going to be much black can do, to really stop the attack that white has here. Once he can pretty much centralize both his knights, up the board, it's really going to be hard for black to stop this attack. His king pretty much is safe over here on the g3 square, so he's pretty much playing e5 to get his other knight into the game and then just start to attack and attack and attack. From here, black took with his pawn on e5, opening up this d file for his rook if he does need it, trying to get some counterplay, but it is probably a little too late. The knight's going to come to e4, trying to get some, obviously some power in the center of the board here. He is attacking this pawn here on f6, which is a huge, threat. Attacking not only the king, but both of the rooks here. The knight from black is going to come to d5. Obviously, he wants to get his knight involved in the game, but at the same time, he really does need to defend this pawn here on f6 because it is a huge weakness for black here. And from here, white's going to bring his knight to c5. And this is probably what Lasker saw all along. And this is a huge move because he's going to be able to take this rook here on d8, or excuse me, on d7. The bishop is kind of forced to bring, to come here on c8. And you look at it and you're like, Kevin, he's just going to leave, his rook hanging. But, if he brings his rook to d6, or d8, then white can come in and take a free bishop here on b7. That's not really what you want to do. In the same fashion, if black were to bring his rook anywhere along the 7th rank, then white could swoop in here, attack the king here, and at the same time forking this bishop on b7. There's now two attackers on this bishop on b7, and it's going to be a free bishop for white here. So black pretty much is forced to play in this situation bishop to c8. And then from here, white can win this exchange and play his knight captures on d7, and after the bishop recaptures, then white's going to start to really get the rest of his pieces involved into the game. Now, you've probably heard a lot of people talk about the end game, which we are in now, obviously. You really want to get your rooks onto the 2nd or the 7th rank. A lot of people say the 2nd rank, but the 7th rank obviously is the same thing. They're just very dangerous. This king's not going anywhere. This rook is pretty much going to wreak havoc the entire time that he's back here. So from here, black's going to play rook to f8, just trying to some way solidify some sort of defense, against white's attack here. Again, he wants to try to add a little bit more pressure to this f6 square. If he ever does want to move his knight here, then this pawn here on f6 is going to be hanging, and this knight here can swoop in anytime he wants to, and that's not going to be good for black. So he brings his rook here to f8. And now white brings his rook to a1. Again, he's already attacking this h-file, and now he's going to bring his rook on a1 over to the a file and start to attack on the opposite side. And it's really hard to defend on two sides of the board, which we talked about before. If you have one weakness, you can maybe defend that, but if you have more than one weakness, it's really hard to defend here. So black's going to play his king to d8, trying to get some sort of safety here. And now the rook's going to come to a8, attacking this king here on d8. And there's not much that black can do. He brings his bishop to c8, and the knight comes to c5. And from here, it is pretty much good game. Now play could continue. After the knight comes to b6 here, then the knight could come to b7 and we could start to attack. And obviously he can't take with his bishop. He can kick back his king to e8. This is again not what happened in the game, but one of the continuations that we may have seen. He could now bring his knight to d6, attacking the king, just really getting all his pieces into the game where they need to be. And then after the king comes back to d8, his only legal move, then the rook can come to b8, and there's nothing what black can do except lose this piece here on b6. And this is if black played, the best moves possible. Obviously, in the game, Capablanca decided just to resign. But in this situation, if the knight moves here from b6, he's going to lose the game. It's going to be checkmate in one. But if he doesn't move his knight, then he's going to lose a knight, and he's going to be even down, more material in the game. So, as most high-level World Chess Champion games are played, once a situation is lost, you pretty much just resign, and that's what Capablanca did in this situation. So, as you can see here, Lasker had a specific plan. He continued with that plan. He executed it very well. Capablanca was kind of all over the board, so keep that in mind in your own game. Even a fantastic player like Capablanca, if you kind of deviate from your plan back and forth and you just kind of play back and just let your opponent attack, and you don't have any sort of counterplay, and you're not really doing anything active with your pieces, more than likely you're going to lose the game. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you haven't already, please subscribe, and I'll see y'all in the next video. Thanks for watching.